Welcome to the Capitol Forum's video interview series. My name is David Blotner, and we are delighted to have Richard Steuer here with us today. Richard is currently a partner at Mayer Brown in New York. Richard is the past chair of the ABA section of antitrust law, and has also served as chair of the Antitrust Committee of the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm good.
Good.
Thank you for having me, David.
Good. Well, we want to talk with you today about an issue that comes up in merger reviews these days. We're all familiar with sort of the economic analysis that goes into merger reviews and how the agencies approach that, but there are also other issues that can come up with merger reviews with either other agencies or other kinds of concerns. I wanted to ask you sort of what your experience has been and what you think about those other areas that can come up.
It's an area that has been quiet for a long time, but it is not quiet any longer. And I brought along a quote that Commissioner Wright quoted from FTC Chairman Perchik back in 1977. And it highlights what we're talking about. Perchik at that time said, "No responsive competition policy can neglect social and environmental harms, resource depletion, energy waste, environmental contamination, worker alienation, and psychological and social consequences of producer-stimulated demands." There was a time when there was a great debate going on in the United States over what the goals of antitrust should be, including things like creating and preserving jobs, preserving small businesses, and all the things that Perchik was talking about. And over the last 30 years, those have been squeezed out of antitrust analysis, leaving only consumer welfare as the goal. And we heard this morning in another session about the difference between consumer welfare and total welfare, but basically whichever you call it, consumer welfare is the only goal. But these other goals haven't disappeared. I like to call them the zombie goals of antitrust because they've just been pushed to other places. So there are other bodies that still consider, should there be job preservation? Should there be preservation of small business? Should there even be things like social alienation taken into account? And one of the things that's now a hot topic is whether income distribution should somehow be a goal of antitrust or social policy more generally. So yes, these goals still exist, but they're no longer called antitrust goals, but political reality is that they are still goals that people have in mind. They just have gone elsewhere.
So where else have they gone?
Well, in the United States, the main place that we see it is the CFIUS review, which is national security. And national security traditionally has been military security, so that it used to be that everyone knew that if you were going to have a merger or acquisition involving a defense contractor, you needed to get through a CFIUS review, which is a committee of many different government organizations. And ultimately, the decision is that of the president, so that if, for instance, a foreign nation were to want to take control of an armaments company in the United States, that would traditionally go through that kind of review. But things have changed. And in today's day and age, with computer hacking and lots of other threats to national security, including, of course, terrorism, there are many, many other dimensions to national security. And so even in the US, the CFIUS review includes not just buying a defense contractor, but even buying a neighbor of a military installation. Or in the one of the most interesting recent CFIUS reviews was the acquisition by a foreign entity of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Is that a national security facility? Well, guess who stays there? The president. So there's quite a bit of concern as to who owns the building if that's where the president stays when he or she is in New York, and so that became a CFIUS review. Other countries have broader reviews than national security. They call it national interest. And for instance, our neighbor to the north, Canada, has the Investment Canada Act that has a test called the net benefits test. And the test is basically, if a foreign acquirer is going to buy a Canadian company, does it have a net benefit to the Canadian economy? And that's hugely different from what we're used to in the United States, although I must say that folks in Congress have introduced bills over the last few years to introduce that same test in the US. There's no sign that it's likely to get much traction anytime soon, but that's a very different way of looking at it.
And there have been some other examples in the U.S. of mergers or acquisitions that have come up that have been rejected on national security. And I think you were talking about the Dubai ports situation.
Well, that's what opened the door. When Dubai ports wanted to buy major U.S. ports, there was quite a bit of pushback because there was a fear that that would somehow jeopardize the security of the port facilities with so many containers coming through. Ultimately, that was abandoned. The same concerns were raised politically when a Chinese company made an offer for Smithfield pork. Would that endanger the American food supply? And Congress raised many, many questions over it. Ultimately, it passed review and that deal was closed. But a deal that was rejected recently was a deal called Rawls. And that was an acquisition by a Chinese company of a windmill farm. Doesn't sound all that strategic, except the windmill farm was next door to a naval facility. And that was actually nixed by the administration. And there were appeals to the federal court, not over the decision, because the decision is not appealable in CFIUS, but access to see what the reasons were. And that case is not over yet, but generally parties have no entitlement to an explanation or to see any of the documentation. And that's common in country after country where it's a true military security situation that countries are reluctant to let anybody know what the reasons were for their decisions.
So with other countries, what are some of the other concerns that can arise with merger reviews, the kinds of things that they have to take into account for their laws? You talked about the Investment Canada Act, but are there other laws around the world that affect mergers as well?
Well, there is a big debate going on in that some agencies, some competition agencies have as part of their mission looking at these other objectives. Often it's job preservation or creation. It can be small business. A goal could be integration of different geographic parts of the country. So in the U.S., our agencies have rejected that. In fact, the head of the Federal Trade Commission, Edith Ramirez, gave a speech not long ago saying that it's important that all the other goals be eliminated from an antitrust analysis because they're noise, and it should be the responsibility of others to look at those other goals. But in South Africa, in contrast, their mission, the mission of the Competition Commission, includes looking at employment, looking at preservation of small businesses, looking at integration of the economies in different parts of the country. And in fact, the South Africans just released and draft a set of guidelines that's almost like a cookbook as to how to do an analysis that balances not just consumer welfare, but employee welfare, small business welfare, and so on. MOFCOM in China also is responsible for more than just consumer welfare as part of their analysis. But in most countries, it's divided among different agencies, so that, for instance, in Australia, the Competition Commission looks at consumer welfare, but the executive, there it's the Treasury, looks at things like preserving national champions or preserving the national interest on a broader scale. Canada's much the same. There are other agencies in Canada that look at that, and sometimes there are clashes between those agencies, which, if you're the party trying to do the deal, can be very disconcerting.
Yeah, so that's the next question is, with all these different factors and all these different concerns and different agencies within a government having to balance this, what kind of problems does that create for you as an attorney who's trying to advise a company that wants to do a particular merger or acquisition?
Well, there are really three. The first is transparency. Do you even know what's going on? The second is timing. Are the timetables aligned? And the third is substance. Are they looking at the same tests, or are there wildly divergent tests? So in terms of transparency, that varies from country to country. Sometimes they have very clear guidelines as to what their timetables are, what they look at. In other countries, it can be something of guesswork to know what's going on. And the timetables can be all over the lot. In the U.S., CFIUS has a very set timetable of different milestones that have to be reached. Our Hart-Scott-Rodino antitrust review has timetables. But if you're also subject to review by another agency like the Federal Communications Commission or the Surface Transportation Board, the timetables can be very different and not quite as set. A stunning example was in Australia, where the Competition Commission approved Archer Daniel Midland's acquisition of a company called Grain Corp, which was a major grain producer in Australia. ADM really didn't have much presence, so there was no competition issue. But 6 months later, and that's where the timing was so unusual, the Treasury Department decided this was contrary to the national interest of Australia to have a non-Australian company. Even though it was the U.S., it didn't, it happens to U.S. companies too. 6 months after the approval of the Competition Commission, they rejected it and blocked the acquisition. So the timing can be quite a problem.
Okay, and substantively, the standards aren't always the same.
Well, that's right.
So what do you do in a situation like that where, the competition review, you say in Australia might say that this is not a problem, but another review applying a different set of standards says it is. How do you sort of deal with that?
That's the biggest challenge for practitioners. You really do need to spend quite a bit of time if you're planning a deal to first take a survey of what reviews you think are going to be out there, and then try to anticipate the standards. And to take just one jurisdiction, if you have a deal that in the U.S. is going to be reviewed by both the Department of Justice or Federal Trade Commission and another agency like the Federal Communications Commission or the Surface Transportation Board, their mandates include more than competition. So it could be diversity of viewpoints in the case of communication, or it could be public safety in the case of a transportation entity. One needs to anticipate that those things are going to be looked at besides competition. And then when you bring in other jurisdictions, if it's a multi-jurisdictional deal, it's like three-dimensional chess. You have to figure out, you have to go through the same analysis in country after country, and then figure out, well, who's going to move first, what are their timetables, and it's certainly important to make sure that the parties understand what they may be up against, because in recent years, a lot of these have come as quite a shock, and people hadn't really anticipated how many different reviews are out there.
So what's the solution to this? Is there a way to fix this problem so that you get the timetables aligned, you can get goals aligned? What's available to try and address this problem?
Well, there is hope. In just the competition area, a group like the International Competition Network, the ICN, which is a group of enforcement agencies around the world, have made tremendous progress in harmonizing the pre-merger notification rules. And so where those were all over the lot some years ago and rather unpredictable, there's been a lot more alignment. They're not perfectly aligned and don't need to be, but there's more transparency. People understand what's necessary, and there has been a gradual movement to try to make the process similar from one country to the next. With regard to these other reviews, we're really in the infancy of this as a concept, because there just weren't that many reviews until recently, and then suddenly now everything is considered a national security or national interest issue more and more. And so the hope is that countries will get together through either a group like the ICN or OECD or some other group and have a dialogue and begin talking about this, and recognize that it does put pressure on multinational parties that are trying to do trans-border deals, and see whether there's room to achieve some greater transparency, to get a little more alignment in what the timetables are likely to be, and also to see if there can be any more alignment on the substantive standards.
Okay, so you think there's some hope in this area, or?
I think there is, simply because it hasn't really been perceived as a problem until very recently, and so nobody's been working on it. And I think once people of goodwill get together and try to address it as a problem in search of a solution, things are likely to be at least better than they are now. They'll never be perfectly aligned, particularly when you come to something like national security. necessarily that's going to be somewhat secretive. It needs to be, and you cannot expect different countries to have alignment in terms of what they think is the national security interest when they're, worried about one another. But that doesn't mean that things can't be more predictable than they are today and more transparent.
What's the country that you think has sort of the farthest to go to sort of get both the transparency and the understanding of sort of what it is that they're looking for when they're doing their merger reviews? Which is the most problematic country these days?
Well, I can't say which is the most problematic. I think the one that's gotten the greatest discussion probably is China. That there is less understanding of what the process is there than there might be, and I wouldn't speculate as to whether that's the fault of the people who just haven't bothered to find out, or whether any of the responsibility lies with the agencies as well. They certainly have been making representatives available to try to talk about the process and have been engaged. But I think questions come up most often. And of course, a lot of the reason for that is that it's such a big economy and has been making quite a few very large investments outside of China recently. So that it has generated a lot of interest and a lot of uncertainty.
Okay. Richard, I want to thank you for speaking with us today. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.